everybody. I'm Erwin Rode. The second slide, which I'm going to show you in a moment, shows a video which was recorded by the BBC, I understand. And your speaker is Arthur C. Clarke, renowned science fiction writer. At the time, I understand he also wrote the script for the 2001 An Odyssey. And he also was a consultant to NASA.
But what about the city of the day after tomorrow, say the year 2000? I think it will be completely different. In fact, it may not even exist at all. Oh, I'm not thinking of the atom bomb and the next Stone Age. I'm thinking of the incredible breakthrough which has been made possible by developments in communications, particularly the transistor and, above all, the communications satellite. These things will make possible a world in which we can be in instant contact with each other, wherever we may be, where we can contact our friends anywhere on Earth, even if we don't know their actual physical location. It will be possible in that age, perhaps only 50 years from now, for a man to conduct his business from Tahiti or Bali just as well as he could from London. In fact, if it proves worthwhile, almost any executive skill, any administrative skill, even any physical skill, could be made independent of distance. I am perfectly serious when I suggest that one day we may have brain surgeons in Edinburgh operating on patients in New Zealand. When that time comes, the whole world will have shrunk to a point, and the traditional role of the city as a meeting place for man would have ceased to make any sense. In fact, men will no longer commute, they will communicate. They won't have to travel for business anymore, they'll only travel for pleasure. I only hope that when that day comes, and when the city is abolished, the whole world isn't turned into one giant suburb.
Right, there we are. Quite amazing prediction also. And it looks like we are now at that point in history where it's going to be decided whether we are going to keep on parking on freeways for 1 hour every morning, or whether we are going to work from home or from a decentralized office about 1 kilometer from your home, things like that. So it's a critical point for offices. But first things first, let's look at the world economy. It is very weak, and therefore you can't expect much from South Africa's economy, given the weak world economy. I think economists are now in agreement that over the next 5 years we're not going to see much growth from 2019 onwards. As you can see there, the forecast that we are using is that by 2025, we will maybe have recovered from 2019, 2019's total GDP. And then, of course, there's the fiscal crisis, which is going to create this very slow growth. Not to mention the virus, which is still with us, but I think the virus will be solved within a year or 18 months. Eskom, of course, we all know about Eskom, the brain drain, dysfunctional education, which is a long-term problem. The zero-sum game that the government is playing with us. The government is more interested in reslicing the pie than growing the pie. The endemic corruption, and then, of course, what's also coming our way is this great technological disruption. The problem with these revolutions is that it's very painful for the first few decades, and many people will be thrown out of jobs, not to mention South Africa. Right, looking at the shorter term, it's a fiscal problem. The fiscus has run out of space. SOEs are dysfunctional. Consumers are under serious financial strain. There's the risk of a second local COVID-19 wave, maybe starting Christmas time, who knows? And then, of course, there's a low short-term interest rates, which is the good news. But the question is, for how long should we have to go cap in hand to the IMF again? Right, we're looking here at the world and the South African GDP growth forecasts for what it's worth. And you can see for South Africa, from the current low point, very little growth. And for IMF for the world, 2.7%. So South Africa is forecast to be much, much lower than the rest of the world. Right, the long-term cycle. Every year when I have this presentation, I show this, but I can't help it. You can't understand the property market without this long-term cycle. What you're seeing there is the reddish color. That is building costs, the long-term trend line of building costs. And around it, you see oscillating prices or rentals for that matter. It's a very long cycle, 15 to 20 years normally. However, I can tell you now already that the current cycle will be much longer than 20 years. The point about it is that when you are above that reddish line, above the building cost line, then the prices tend to go into a frenzy, and vice versa. Of course, from an investor's point of view, the best time to buy is in the trough, when prices are below that line. Right, and taking that prices line and dividing it by the building costs, you get graph 2, which is deflated prices. It's important to note that these deflated prices represent not a single property, because single properties, the age, and at about 1% or so per annum relative to new. So what this really represents is a notional portfolio which is kept prime by selling old properties and developing or buying newer properties into the portfolio. It's a reasonable question. Why is this property cycle so long? Well, on the demand side, we've got irrational investor exuberance near the peaks, as I've said before, creating asset bubbles. We are seeing that happening all over the world right now because of very low interest rates. And of course, we must remember, the worse the exuberance, the longer the recovery. So this makes me very worried about the American economy. And then, of course, there's the culture of you can never go wrong with bricks and mortar. So your average buyer of property doesn't look at the long cycle. In fact, they don't know about the long cycle because they don't spend money investing money on the Trends publication of Rode, which explains this in detail. On the supply side, I call it the development imperative. Development teams try to survive during bad times, as we are seeing now. It's a difficult decision to break up your team when the cycle turns, of course. Yeah, and then building construction has a long gestation period. In CBDs, it's about 5 years. In the decentralized areas, about 2 years. And we start adding all the other municipal regulations and that you've got to jump over, then of course it's a bit longer than that. And then maybe the most important reason of all is the super durability of the building inventory. You can compare that with, say, a consumer good like a can of beans, which is consumed over a very short period. So you never actually have an oversupply of cans of beans. Not so, because it's very easy to shut off your machines. But in the case of property, the building inventory, single property lasts for about 30, 40, 50, 60 plus years. So once you've got an oversupply, you can't wipe out the current inventory by eating it. You've got to wait for demand to pick up and to eventually eat up and mop up that oversupply. And that explains the very long cycle. Right, so it's a very, very difficult task for the market to match supply and demand. Here's some empirical evidence of the long cycle. You're looking at the national office property cycle. I'm using Joburg real decentralized office rentals. Now, I say decentralized up to about 1972. It's actually, it is CBD, but thereafter it's actually decentralized rentals. Yeah, the first thing you will notice is this very long cycle, the very long difference between the troughs. The beginning here is actually 1960, although we don't show it going back to 1960, but we know the trough was in 1960. And then the next trough was in 1976, 77, thereabout. You can see that as a long period, and so forth and so on. What is of concern is that the peaks and the troughs are trending down. Of course, one of the reasons why these peaks and troughs are trending down is because we got inflation under control. So that in itself is not a problem. But you will see that as with the coincident with the economy that is going to sleep, you will see that rentals are forecast to, in real terms, to decline below previous low points. Very important point. So this tells us that I'm afraid the prognosis for the office property cycle, for office property investments is not all that good. And of course, while we're on this topic, I might mention the reasons for this. Then in the first place, of course, we are at the bottom of a long cycle, and the cycle is going to be extra long because of the fiscal problem that we are all facing. And of course, the prospects for the economy is not all that good for the next few years. And on top of that, we're starting off with a very high vacancy rate of about 12+%, depending on the specific node. So these two factors together, not to forget, of course, the whole problem of maybe working from home, all these factors together is making it quite a pessimistic scenario for us. Industrial property cycle. Now, the strange thing about the industrial property cycle is that in real terms, rentals have been declining. The trend line has been declining. Yes, you have your cycle within the downtrend, but the problem is why. And I don't really have an answer to this question. So if anybody in the audience can come up with a reason why the trend in the real terms of industrial rentals have been going down for so long, I'll really appreciate it. There are a few possibilities which I'm not going to discuss now, but please come back to me and tell me what you surmise are the reasons for this strange effect. Having said that, starting 2005, the trend has been sideways in real terms. Okay, so where are we now in this very long cycle? In the case of houses, we are still far above the replacement cost trend line, which means that houses are actually still expensive. Unlike what happened, say, in America after the great crash of 2008, house prices in South Africa didn't collapse completely because our banks were less naughty than the American banks. Right, and then in the case of office and industrial buildings, we are now well below the replacement cost trend line. Thus, office and industrial properties are fundamentally cheap. However, having said that, to call the recovery point is difficult. I think it's going to be 4, 5, 6 years from now, depending on how we are going to manage our public sector bill from here onwards. Right, the office property market in more detail. You see here that the interesting thing is that vacancy rates of the CBD properties have been moving sideways for a long time, since about 2012. And of course, the reason for that is that no new developments have been taking place there. And on top of that, many a building had been mothballed or converted to housing. Whereas the decentralized vacancy rate has been climbing consistently since, in fact, 2008, more or less. This is a long-term trend, and it'll take a long time to revert it. Right. Real office rentals have thus been declining because of the very high vacancy rates. And you can see we are forecasting declining real office rental rates for a long time to come. May I point out that how Pretoria has outperformed the rest of the country since about 2010 or thereabouts. The New South Africa has really been kind to Pretoria. Right, the industrial property market. We are comparing here Rode's vacancy factors, which is the red broken line, with industrial rentals. And you can see, as you would expect, a very nice inverse relationship. So even in the case of industrial properties, when your vacancies trend higher, then rentals tend to trend lower. Forecast of real industrial rentals, right, also going down, down, down. There's one exception, and that's the Cape Peninsula. I must say, it's very brave of us to forecast that Cape Town industrial rentals will recover first in the middle of this forecast period. But that's based on the previous very good performance of the Cape Peninsula's property market. The retail property market, as we know, of course, that the consumer is under huge pressure. So what you're looking at here is trading density growth from the MSCI research. And yes, as you would have expected, there's been a huge drop, catastrophic drop, and it seems it's affecting the larger shopping centers more than the smaller shopping centers. It's a psychological thing. You pop in at your local grocer rather than the big super regional or regional shopping center. At least that is a possible explanation. Yeah, so when trading densities are underperforming, of course, you would expect that market rentals will also underperform. So it's a question of time. I'm sure shopping centers are already seeing this happening, that you will have to give remissions to many of your tenants. And yes, guess what? What with every reversion to market, you're going to find that the rental rates will go down. So the prospects for shopping center rentals are not good. I thought you would be interested in what sort of returns you could expect typically from property as an asset class. What you're seeing here, what you're looking at is the performance, the historic performance of institutional type property portfolios going back to 1962. And we do it by cycle, right? So you see three cycles. There's three long super cycles. The first one in the column starts at 1962, but in fact we know it should start from 1960, but we haven't got data going back to 1960. So that 16-year cycle in the first column should actually be an 18-year cycle. And you could see there it's 4.8% real total return. Total return, of course, means income yield plus capital appreciation, as the case may be. And so that 4.8 would probably be something like 4% if you include 1960 and 1961. The next cycle started in 77 and ended in 1996. And just after the New South Africa started, and that was a 20-year cycle, and that is 4.3%. Make that 4 if you like, to rounding it. And the next cycle, we are still in the next cycle, the last one. It started in 1996. And we've got data up to 2019, giving us a total return over this period of an amazing 7.9%, make that 8%. And of course, the reason for that is we had this once-off drop in interest rates when we got inflation under control many years back, and that of course boosted property prices like you can't imagine. As you've seen in my forecast so far, we don't expect that 2019 was the trough of the cycle. In fact, the trough of the cycle may be 4, 5, 6 years from now, given the prospects for South Africa's economy. So that 7.9 will probably work out to be something like 4% again. So in sum, it looks like, and this is international rule of thumb, with a so-called naive buy and hold strategy of a portfolio, you'll find that in the long term, if it's unlisted and ungeared, that you can reckon on total real return of about 4%, say between 4 and 5%, unless you do some very clever things. But this is for a standing portfolio. This is not for a portfolio to which new developments are added from time to time. The market's rating of ungeared property in South Africa, in other words, capitalization rates. You'll see how capitalization rates came down in the early 2000s as we got inflation under control. That is completely logical. And then you'll also notice that from about 2018 onwards, cap rates have been rising steadily. And especially the cap rates of regional shopping centers have been rising quite drastically. As we all know, shopping centers used to be the blue-eyed boy of the property industry. It looks like that is going to change. At the moment, as we know, industrial properties are actually performing better than offices and shopping centers. Of course, the problem with shopping centers is that we oversupplied it. That is, the market oversupplied it, and the same applies to offices. South Africa's economy has been problematic since about 9-8 years ago, and unfortunately, our developers just kept on building, and this is the end of the end result. Conclusions. Human capital and infrastructure backlogs and our sovereign debt ratio are constraints on South Africa's economic growth. Yeah, and we all know we are poor savers. Thus, financial markets will keep South Africa's fiscal policy on the straight and narrow, one hopes. The problem is, at the moment, the government keeps on promising, or at least the Treasury keeps on promising, that they will rein in the public sector's wage bill and salary bill, but it needs to be seen. That is crucial. That is the one crucial takeaway of this presentation. Unless South Africa can rein in the runaway salary bill of the public sector and the SOEs, we're not going to solve the fiscal problem, and it will become worse and worse and worse. And therefore, the recession will become longer and more frequent. Residential properties are still reasonably expensive, so they've got more room to go down in real terms, right? And if you come to think of it, that because of the your average consumer is under huge pressure, it's a reasonable expectation that residential properties prices will go down further in real terms for quite a few years. I know at the problem at the moment, we don't expect it to have happened, but it's actually happening. That at the moment, residential prices are actually only slightly below the inflation rate. The question is how long this will last. I don't think it can last. It's not sustainable. Office properties, yes, they are fundamentally cheap at the moment, but vacancies persist and prospects are very poor, given all those factors I've already mentioned. Industrial properties are fundamentally cheap, so they are actually at the moment, I would guess, of your normal subclasses within the property market. They are probably one of your better bets, especially in the Cape Peninsula. Highly indebted consumers face challenges. Yes, we've already dealt with that. The number of civil servants and their salary increase will have to moderate in years. I've already dealt with that. Or else, hello to the IMF. And the IMF is not going to give us loans without strenuous conditions attached to it. Thus, more cash flows will remain under pressure, especially more, I think, in low-income locations, because I think that's where most of the layoffs and most of the salary decreases will probably happen. Total returns on REITs will remain significantly lower than what we are used to, because we are now in a new paradigm, and South Africa is heading for an extended period of social upheaval. It's inevitable that because when people's expectations are not met, and let's face it, over the past 25 years, huge expectations have been created. When you bash those expectations, as you go into a prolonged recession, oh boy, expect extended period of social upheaval. That's the explanation for the spring uprisings in the Northern African Arabian countries a few years ago, and I think it's also going to apply to South Africa. In fact, we're already having it, don't we? Well, that's the end of my presentation. I thank you, and please subscribe to Rode's Review. It's our gratis newsletter. In that way, you will be kept up to date, not only with what Rode is doing, but also some of our products. Thank you very much.